Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to Shit They Don't Tell You on Sunday, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Well, welcome to episode 12 this week. Today, our guest is Pastor Kelsey Fitting-Snyder, who is the pastor at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Waco, Texas. Coming all the way from across the country in Texas. Oh. I know Kelsey. Kelsey's from Pennsylvania and is a Penn State fan. And so when I recorded with Pastor Melissa, our Nebraska fan, I apparently was wearing some Hawkeye colors. Allison pointed that out to me. She's like, "Did you do that on purpose?" And I didn't. But today I did. I was representing the Hawkeyes on purpose.
That's funny. You know, this is the first time I've not lived in like a Big Ten area. So people here could care less that I like Penn State because it's mostly Big 12 stuff. So sometimes I'll cheer for Iowa State because they'll play Baylor, and I'll cheer for Iowa State just to spite them. But yeah,
you lived in Iowa for a little while, so like that counts.
Yeah. And I lived in Nebraska too. So I have some love for my other Big Ten schools, but we are Penn State. That's just how it is.
Again, this is why I'm representing. I want to say, speaking of Allison and football, she is really lucky that I love her so much because her wedding takes place on the weekend of the Iowa-Maryland game in Maryland. And I have been waiting to go to that. They haven't played each other in Maryland since I've lived on the East Coast. And they probably won't again for another 5 years. I'm a little salty about it still, but I will be in Wisconsin.
Yes. The things that we do for the people in our lives that we love dearly.
Because I do plan my calendar in the fall around Hawkeye football, but there are some things we make exceptions for.
Yeah. Well, here it's fun because nobody cares about Penn State. And so, everything revolves around Baylor football here and times of games. And it's we can't plan certain things at certain times or meetings at certain times because of Baylor, and not just football, but basketball too. Like if there's a Baylor game on a Sunday or, some night during the week, we cancel our meetings because people are at the game.
Well, they're pretty good at basketball, aren't they?
I mean, the men just won a championship and the women won,
So maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I guess.
Though, that is a thing to bring up. And, when you talk about like churches and trying to work around some of these things, because I've heard of pastors that live in Wisconsin, and everybody in Wisconsin, their life revolves around Packers, right? And so if it's NFL season, and it's a Sunday, so I know pastors that during football season, they alter the church's worship schedule and have one at 7:30 in the morning or something, so that or abbreviated services, to do something to work with people, so that they come to church before they go to the football game.
Yeah,
or to just go celebrate it. So you're not alone. I think that happens in a lot of places, and it's whoever says the church isn't adaptable.
Yeah, we're so good at change, right?
For things that matter, like sports.
Yeah.
But maybe not some other topics.
Yeah, maybe not for women.
Speaking of, shall we get into our topic of the day?
Yeah, deep dive.
All right. So today we're going to talk about the gospel reading for Sunday, June 27th. For those of you who are going to go to a church that follows the Revised Common Lectionary on Sunday, June 27th. If you're not, great. We're going to tell you all about it anyways. And so the gospel lesson is Mark 5, verses 21 to 43. Is that right?
Yeah. Because we got to start with Jairus' daughter and...
You're going to say 25 to 34.
That's the story that we're talking about.
Oh, so do I need to read the whole thing?
Probably not, right? Because we're
Great.
probably not going to talk about the other part.
Cool. We'll save a little bit of time, and I'm not going to read you all 22 of these verses because it's a lot and you don't need to hear it. Pastor Kelsey is better than I am, so she knows that we need to read only 25 to 34 to get into our topic for today. So I am going to do that. Okay. Mark 5, 25 to 34. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." And immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Gospel of the Lord.
Yeah.
So, as you said, this is part of a larger story where Jesus is actually on his way to Jairus' house to heal his daughter.
Yes.
And a woman just comes up to him in a crowd and touches him.
I don't know. This story always like makes me like a little emotional. And after hearing like this really powerful sermon on it at the Festival of Homiletics, I don't know. I don't often get, this is bad to say, I don't just get moved by the Bible. It's like when I talk about it, but
Yeah.
But that story, just hearing it, it
Tell me,
me
what did the person at the Festival of Homiletics say that just like really moved you about this story?
Oh gosh, well, it was Reverend Otis Moss III. So if you've ever, heard him preach or give a sermon, it just
I don't think I know who that is.
Okay, well, I don't know too much about him. Other than I've heard him at the Festival of Homiletics multiple times, and he's an advocate and social justice, champion.
Also, just so people may not, homiletics is preaching.
Oh, yes.
Like you've ever heard someone say a homily, it's a sermon, right? Typically a homily is considered short and a sermon is considered long, but like homiletics just means like the art of preaching.
Yeah, and you would think, so I was skeptical the very first time that I actually went to this in person. It was a few years ago. And I was like, I'm going to go hear a bunch of people preach for 4 days. And I was like, is that going to be good? But it was great. And everything that you need to sort of, as a preacher, to just sort of re-energize you. This year it was all virtual. But yeah, Otis Moss preached on this text, and a few things that really stood out was the language that he used and the way that he framed this woman. And so maybe we should get into some of that and some of the history about this woman. So this woman who had said that she was hemorrhaging for 12 years. But some translations will say that she had the flow of blood.
Right, which is an inaccurate like translation. So what we see as hemorrhage here is a flow issue of blood. So rice is the feminine noun meaning the flow issue. And in the Greek New Testament, we only hear it here and in the Luke version of this exact same story. But and then hematos is obviously the word for blood, which we get, hematology, hemoglobin, all those good
Yeah.
medical blood words, those come
Yeah.
from the Greek.
Yeah. And so because this woman had this flow of blood and
Well, okay, so hang on.
yeah.
So the reason that we know that this is definitely like her issue here is menstruation, right? Like this
Yes.
is what this she's been menstruating for 12 years. So that's clearly a flow of blood issue. And
Yeah.
the reason that we know that they're talking about menstruation here and not any other kind of hemorrhaging is because the only other time that like this word gets used then is in the Old Testament in the Septuagint, which I know we've mentioned before is the Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament that was written in like 100 something BC in Alexandria for Greek speaking Jews that lived there.
Yeah.
And so this word here, in the only other place in the Bible that they really talk about menstruation is rules about it in Leviticus, because Leviticus is literally just a book of rules for the Israelite people.
Yeah.
And in the Septuagint, this is the word that they use for menstruation there.
Yeah. So you want me to read this rule?
Yeah, let's read the rules. What
Let's set
are
it
the
up.
rules for menstruation?
Here we go. This is Leviticus 15. This is NRSV 25 to 27. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, so her period, not at the time of her impurity, her period, or if she has discharge beyond the time of her impurity, her period, all the days of the discharge shall continue in uncleanness, as in the days of her impurity. She shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies during all the days of her discharge shall be treated as the bed of her impurity. And everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanness of her impurity. Whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes, and bathe in water, and be unclean until the evening. So let's talk about this.
Additionally, there's also a rule in Leviticus. I don't know if it's in 15 or if it's a little later, but like essentially you're also like the only other rule is that you're not allowed to have sex while you're in this menstruating unclean state.
Yeah. So I think there's a misconception when we talk about what it means to be clean and unclean in this tradition. So if people, it's a ritual thing. So it's not really about your character. So to be unclean doesn't mean that you are sinful and you need to be cleansed of your sin. It's
right,
all
that's
about
a good distinction, because I think Christianity has really kind of warped that a little bit.
Yeah. So it's people need to be ritually clean to participate in the religious life of the temple and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so where I love where Otis Moss went with his sermon then is he talked about how some theologians and biblical scholars have used a different translation of those words. And he talked about being restricted or unrestricted. Mm. And that restricted word is sort of what really touched me, especially when we think about women's health now. But so if we think about this woman in the gospel reading, she would have been restricted. She would have been living a restricted life. She would have lived in a community of other restricted people next to other neighborhoods of other restricted people. So people who've had other ailments or other conditions that made them unclean, unable to be associated with other people. Because again, if they came in contact with others, they would make other people unclean.
Yeah, so to the point where also, so when women were in this unclean state, they were also not allowed to, like, they couldn't cook dinner for their family. They couldn't share dinner with their family. They couldn't, right? Like that would make other people unclean. They weren't allowed to go out into public because they could come in contact with people and also, make them unclean.
Yeah.
So the thing about like talking about menstruation and the Bible, and why this particular topic, and about just women's health in general is super important to Pastor Kelsey and I, is because like it's a topic that never gets talked about. So I was talking with my friend Jess a couple weeks ago, and told her we were going to do this podcast. And what she said to me was, she was like, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing." Growing up, not once ever did a pastor, a youth director, a Sunday school teacher, anybody in my church, not once did anybody ever talk about this in church. And so like, I mean, and I think that's true. I'm thinking about growing up. I'm like, do I remember? I think like I may have had conversations, but it was more so like someone was bleeding, right? And so it was just like a practical conversation at like a youth retreat about like, you know.
Yeah. And but like not even in church though. We just like don't talk about it in general because like, you know, I had a conversation with my husband yesterday. I told him I was doing this podcast and he was like, "Oh, what are you talking about?" And I was talking about, well, women with the flow of blood. I was like, "We're talking about periods and menstruation." And he's like, "That's in the Bible?" And I said, "Yeah, it comes up in the lectionary in like 2 weeks." And he was really like grossed out by it because anytime you talk about like menstruating or women's periods or ovaries or anything like that, it just wigs him out.
So, I mean, and so like, this is a cultural thing, right? Like we just culturally are, it's supposed to be a hush hush topic. Like you're just not supposed to talk about it. Like that's just the thing. Like you just don't talk about. Which if you think about like how such a natural and essential, like absolutely essential part of life, that, you know, the menstrual cycle is to the grand scheme of the entire world. And that roughly 50% of the world's population, experiences this. It's kind of like crazy to me that like we can't talk about it. Yeah. And I would say that has more to do with influences, and particularly influences of men. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about menstruation in the Bible, you know, it's pretty much all bets are off. We can talk about whatever we want, right? Because like these are things we don't have a lot of instructions from our forefathers on, because the idea of, you know, just menstruation is so disgusting to men that over the last 2,000 years, they didn't talk about it. Like they have rules for everything, right? Like the amount of rules that the church forefathers, these white men came up with to tell us how to do everything in life, remarkably silent when it comes to the topic of women bleeding out of their vaginas.
Yeah.
How strange.
But let's like think about it for a second, because like our bodies do such crazy things.
Well, this is what I said. Like, this is literally essential to life on, you know, like to human life, to, well, not just human, like any mammals, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the funny thing, the ironic thing is too, is that we talk about Jesus' blood all the time. The church loves to talk about Jesus' blood.
Yeah.
But we can't talk about women's blood.
Oh, I have a good quote from one of the articles that I read.
Yeah.
In our sanitized society, the monthly flow of several tablespoons may cause more anxieties than it did for those ancients who were frequently exposed to bloody sacrifices at shrines or to bloody killings by hunters.
Yeah.
That's from William Fitz in his article, The Menstrual Taboo in the Judeo-Christian Tradition, in the Journal of Religion and Health.
Wow.
And that was in 1980, I think, that he wrote that. Like, he addressed that a long time ago.
Yeah.
So the thing about, like, menstrual flows and men. So, I mean, let's be clear. We know today that a monthly menstrual cycle is literally the woman's body as it is preparing to carry a child, and then when it doesn't, is shedding that so that it can start the cycle all over again. And then if a woman becomes pregnant, then the cycle doesn't, you know, finish. Then it moves into a different phase of making a new life, right? And particularly making a human. Like, a woman's body has the ability to create a second human being. from 2 cells. And like, that's just, I mean, just think about when we talk about like God, the creator, and the power and majesty that comes with creation, woman's ability to be a co-creator with God is such, like, the miracle of life is like, I mean, it's just that, like, it is insane. This beauty and this wonder that God created, and how it is that, you know, that we reproduce. And so to think about, like, a menstrual cycle is the most like natural thing in the world, right? Like, it is a part of the life cycle. And so to think about the fact that, like, we know this now, right?
Yeah.
But over the course of human history, you know, people weren't always as scientifically smart as we are today. And so philosophies that came up with, particularly by men, about why women menstruate vary. One religious perspective was that because Eve ate the damn apple, all women are cursed, right? Like, that we are now inherently evil, and this is our curse, to have a monthly painful flow of blood.
Yeah. I'm doing this with my congregation, or for Bible study for Genesis. And I just read in a commentary that when the snake or the serpent is talking, that when he talks about, when he says you, it's a plural you. So to imply that, like, Adam was like standing right there.
Yep. So I say this all the time to make it very clear to everybody. And I think I probably said this on a podcast before, but to be very clear that, like, 99% of the time, that might be a high percentage, but very high percentage of the time in the English Bible, when you see you, it is most likely a plural. It is a you all. That's just like, it just doesn't translate well into English. And I think that like, if I really was a good pastor, I would go through the lectionaries each week and change them to you alls and maybe, or some y'alls, because that's an okay thing to say in Maryland. Also in Texas, y'alls in the Bible.
Y'all is part of my vocabulary now. My phone even auto corrects to it. So
nice.
Yeah.
This is what we need. We just need to go through the whole Bible, and every time you see a you, put a y'all there.
Yeah,
because that's what the author is really trying to say.
Yeah.
Anyways, another philosophy has to do with, you know, well, women are evil, right? And this is their punishment. But also that just apparently at some point in time, they also thought that just like once a month, women were possessed by demons, and that's why they started bleeding. Which, I mean, that doesn't really make much sense to me. Like, all the women in the world just cyclically are possessed by demons. But again, it's the same thing of perpetuating that women are lesser, that women are inferior, that for some reason the fact that women bleed once a month makes them weak. And another one, so again, we talked about this a couple weeks ago when we actually talked about that from Genesis, the deal with the apple there. We talked about Saint Augustine and how horrible that he was, and what he thought. Right? No, it's Thomas Aquinas that said that women were defective males, and so this is just part of their defect, right? Which is just. I realize that, like, looking and thinking about these absurd things that men have said over the course of history from my educated 21st century perspective, it just is ludicrous to me to think about, I mean, just how beautiful the life cycle is, and the integral part that women's menstrual cycles play, and how this was once considered bad. When, if you think about it, this is probably the most beautiful gift, really, that God gives women. And only women. So, like, take that, men. You don't have this ability to make life.
And that's why I love the woman in this story so much. Just because, like, think of, like, the courage that it took her to do this. So, you know, if we try to put this in, like, a modern day understanding. She had been dismissed by doctor after doctor. She tried to advocate for her health, and all of these, doctors dismissed her. She couldn't find care, and they
or
probably
she
tried
did
to
find care, and it was just super shitty men doing terrible things to her, and she spent all the money on it.
Yeah, and like this is her pre-existing condition, and they don't want to touch her.
Yeah.
So the ironic thing too. So she has the courage to get out in this crowd, which she knows she's not supposed to be around technically, right?
Right. She's restricted, right? Like this is a no thing to do.
Yeah, she's like on the ground, like trying to not cause a scene, like and she has to get past the church people, because the disciples are like around him trying to protect Jesus. And that's who she has to get by to get the care that she needs.
So let's talk about that, about how the church is often in the way of access to women's care.
Yeah.
You know what, is this debate in the 21st century is alive and well, and I know, Kelsey, that you see that probably more prominently where you live in Texas, than I do in a super deep blue state and city.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just access to care is difficult. And, even just getting women that live in, impoverished areas, or like just access to things like tampons and pads, because, they bleed every month. And so just simple things. And then access to care when they do have an issue. Is difficult. Here we have a Planned Parenthood. I say it's in Waco, but it's actually, you kind of have to drive a little bit to get to it. It's not, anywhere with easy access. There's a tall wall sort of around it. But almost every day of the week, you can find people standing outside with their signs and trying to instigate and get people to honk, and they're little kids and they don't even know why they're there.
So, I mean, so part of this is a major, I think, misconception about what it is that Planned Parenthood does. And a majority of their work, honestly, is education and just giving people who maybe don't have the means access to healthcare for women, right? And part of this is because we also don't we don't talk about it, right? Like, this is such a taboo subject that like we don't teach our young girls about their bodies, and also about their rights over their bodies, right? Because apparently in a country where, we claim freedom, and that, everyone, like, people, I don't have to get vaccinated because it's my freedom not to. But at the same time, those exact same people are standing there trying to tell women what to do with their own bodies.
Yeah. And it's so heartbreaking. And this was just recent. I had a college friend, excuse me, who has recently like gone to a Planned Parenthood because she had just like a routine checkup, women get their annual exams, make sure everything's okay.
Yeah.
And
again, those are to check for cancer, to check for other things that are like, that could be very wrong, right?
Yeah.
So.
And she is a musician. She's an opera singer. And, during the pandemic, lost health insurance. Right. And so having a place like Planned Parenthood that she could go to get care. And she was screamed at while she was walking in to the clinic, just going to the doctor. And it scarred her. And this is somebody who, actually goes to church pretty faithfully and is a church going person, and understands that people have different beliefs. But when you're just trying to go to the doctor and you have people yelling at you that believe in the same God you do.
Yeah. That somehow God wouldn't want women to have access to healthcare. And again, I think it comes down to a misperception of what it is that Planned Parenthood does. So I was telling Kelsey before we started recording, so my best friend in Iowa works for Planned Parenthood, and I was talking to her just a little bit about like doing this podcast to see if she, would have some thoughts or something, and kind of what it would be like. And I asked her, well, if you heard two pastors talking about this topic, what would you want to hear them say? And for her, it was just that it's okay to talk about it. And that it's, that like to understand, to hear from a pastor that like God loves you if you have a uterus, and that, that God, loves you and has given you this amazing gift, and that we need to talk about it more. And that also that there's another theological perspective besides the fact that like apparently Planned Parenthood just advocates baby killing. That there's that's not what it is, and that you can listen to pastors say that. I will say another part of our conversation that I found particularly intriguing. So she spends a lot of time talking with legislators and stuff. And so I asked about, well, does this ever come up? Like, do you ever talk to them about like, the tampon taxes or other things like that? And she was like, oh no, they take that off they take that off of the list, off of the schedule before we even get in there. Like they see the word vagina or they see menstruation or tampon and just immediately like you can't, like they can't even have conversations with legislatures about these things because they literally won't talk about it.
And like, how is that not a necessity? So like I've lived in a few different states, and every state has different like sales tax stuff, and it's complicated. And so, in Pennsylvania, things that are like necessities, like groceries and clothes and things like that, there's not tax on, but that's not universal across states. And so there is taxes on things here in Texas, and there weren't things in Iowa and whatever. But
in Iowa, it's just like healthy foods. Like you won't get taxed on bananas, but you will get taxed on potato chips.
Yeah. So, but like, why would something like that not be a necessity when 50% of the population, or even maybe more than that, bleed every month, if they're regular,
Yeah. And again, so this is the problem, right? So like when we think about that this should be a tax-free item, we can't even get it in front of legislators because they won't talk about tampons. That because this topic is so deplorable that we cannot talk about it. I don't know. It's just crazy.
Well, and it's hard to because culturally there are differences as well. And when we think of the word restricted, there are women that are still restricted in churches today.
Yeah. So you won't see this in the United States, but in some other countries, particularly with Eastern Orthodox churches, which are in like Russia and other Eastern European places, women are still not allowed to take communion if they're menstruating. Part of me is like, how do they police that? It's just like a self-policing thing, or what? Or like your husband will deny it to you? I'm really confused about how they.
Oh, that is a good question.
I think about that. But then there's also places still where like women aren't even allowed to go into the church or temple while they're menstruating. You see this in churches in India, and this has more to do with the influence of the culture on Christianity there. But that's more of a cultural thing that just gets infused into the Christian church.
Yeah. I don't know. It's still just like sometimes I just don't understand like why things are still a thing.
But I mean, like, so here's the deal. The fact in like, so all of us generally come out of the Roman Catholic tradition at some point in time. And I mean, that was a conversation. Like they had it like at some certain point in time, you were not, when it was the same. And then I'm not actually totally sure when it got changed. It was a very long time ago. But eventually they were like, oh, that's dumb.
Yeah. And there's also, I think there's still today, we talk about how, in biblical times, it was, this clean and unclean thing or whatever, and ritually, but there had to be some shame too, that was part of this.
There's still shame.
And right. And that, yeah, exactly. And that's like, you think about young girls and, how they feel the first time, that this happens and they're at school or, and,
or the first time you bleed through your pants, right? Like, cause every girl has done that at least once when she was young, because, you're still figuring it out.
Yeah. And you need, like, I remember, when I first started using like tampons and stuff, like they would give you like special cases so that people didn't know that like that's what you were doing, or like always having to like have a purse and carry your purse with you to the bathroom so people didn't see that, you had your period. Mm-hmm. Or I think of, again, people that are that can't afford products, and girls that have to stay home from school because they don't have access to the things that they need.
Yeah. Addition to that is something that again my friend Jamie has talked about like trying to get in front of legislatures, is talking about that like tampons and pads should be like essential and given as a part of like our women's correctional facilities, and they're not. Mm-hmm. So that think about just incarcerated women often don't have access to them at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And if they do, they get, a couple of pads, maybe a pad for, a week.
And anybody out there who has a menstrual cycle understands how far that probably goes.
Right. Yeah. So
I remember when they started making the compact tampons, that like it was just like easier to hide them then.
Right,
because, again,
exactly.
This is the thing, like we have to hide that there is still shame, that you don't want people to know that you're bleeding.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like being on a youth trip, with girls, and, them like trying to like sneakily come over to like tell you like, hey, I need the health kit. I need the health kit.
Can I tell you about so for me, the most unprepared period that I've ever had. So I was on an island to island canoe trip in the Apostle Islands, which is in Lake Superior in northern Wisconsin, off of northern Wisconsin. And I was in college, and I was one of the adult leaders. And it was me as like the female leader, and then a male pastor as like the pastor leader. And then we had youth that were on this trip. And so like we're on an island in the middle of the Great Lakes. And I just didn't think ahead, didn't calculate, like, wasn't thinking. And so I was unprepared. And like I had to go to my pastor, right, and be like, listen, this is happening and I need help. And so he was really, really sweet about it. He also has 2 daughters, so he understands. But he went and he made this grand, elaborate excuse to the youth that he by himself was just going to kayak back to the mainland. He's the fastest kayaker and could get there by himself, like lickety split. And the rest of us, it would take all day. That he just was going to kayak back there because we've been so good and everyone deserves some ice cream. And so he literally one afternoon, like I took the kids and we hung out in the water because like that's what I could do that day. And he kayaked all the way back to the mainland and bought ice cream and a box of tampons for me. And it was just super sweet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like, but like, luckily he wasn't like he knew what to do. He wasn't like, so
yeah, he could have been like really weird about it, made it really awkward, and totally wasn't, and was really, really great about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why, I don't know, I just love this woman in this text so much because she just knows like what she needs and she goes after it. And we don't know her name, so we know that she wasn't, she was poor. She spent all the money that she had. That was the other thing too, is like she exhausted all of her resources to try to get well. Yeah.
And so what I really like is then how, Jesus's reaction, right? Like, this is one of those moments again where like something super scandalous happens, like a woman should not have touched him, let alone a woman who is bleeding, right? Like super big no. That like she had to go around, his disciples who were like not cool to her at all. And Jesus just, does the thing that Jesus does, right? And just like, your faith has made you well.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, like, I don't know, I read verses like this since, COVID, and it, like the word touching comes up, so much in this verse. And so that's really important, is the touching thing. But Jesus touching, or here he was being touched by people that are restricted or unclean or whatever. It's sort of his like MO, throughout his healing, there's touching.
He just so he always crosses those boundaries, right? Like all the rules, like he talked about with Nicodemus, right? Like he knows all the rules and he breaks them to help people and to heal people anyways.
Oh,
right.
Yep.
That all of these, so all the rules that we have about women, whether they can go into church, whether they can touch people, whether they can do any of these things, Jesus says, screw all of you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna heal them anyways. I'm gonna love them anyways. I'm gonna spend time with the unmarried outcast woman at a well, right? Like, and take water from her. Like, just again, all these things that like, all these rules that, this is also why I don't understand the people that are so shitty to women in the church is sort of like, did you not pay attention to anything Jesus said?
Yeah. Yeah. And so like, the healing here is personal, obviously, for the woman, but it's a social thing. It's redefining these social boundaries, these social constructs of the time. And like this huge thing then happens when he calls her daughter.
Yeah.
Daughter. And this is where Otis Moss in his sermon just like, he just went for it. But it's a huge thing.
That's personal.
It is very personal because not even the disciples are called sons. So this he says daughter. So she is part of his family.
Yeah.
And she's a woman.
I can see you get a little emotional about that one. It's pretty it's deep.
Yeah. Yeah. She is, these are not my words. This is Otis Moss again. She is a princess because she is the daughter of the king of the Judeans.
Yeah.
And she has a period. Period.
Full stop. Yeah, that's super beautiful. And yeah, I mean, like, I like that image of like, the women being sort of the princesses, sort of the heirs and the daughters of the king, right? Of sort of like, again, that this is this thing where we get to be co-creators of life, that we get the beautiful gift from God to help continue the kingdom, to make the kingdom.
Yeah. So like Jesus breaks the stigma there, and so how do we do that today? Like how, I guess us talking about it is important, but like, how do we break that stigma?
Listen, and I think more people, again, so this is, again, these uncomfortable things in the Bible that we don't like to talk about. And, you know, I bet that, you know, Jess isn't the only person out there that's been like, oh yeah, my pastor never wants to talk about menstrual cycles in church. There are some, and I hope when this comes up in the lectionary, it gets talked about. I will talk about it. So if you go to Salem Lutheran Church in South Baltimore or the Episcopal Church of the Redemption, you're going to hear about periods on Sunday, the 27th. And I hope that you find something beautiful in that. And if anybody out there, for any reason, doesn't get enough of me on this podcast, and wants to listen to my sermons ever, you can do that. If you go to redemptionbaltimore.org/sermons, you'll be able to find that there on that Sunday. But yeah, you're going to hear me name Jesus as that guy that, you know, again, crosses those borders.
Yeah.
It's beautiful stuff. But yeah, we need to continue to talk about it, and to let young women know that it's okay, that this isn't a shameful thing. And for those of you who might be bleeding right now, I'm going to say this is a gift from God, and you're probably not going to feel that right now, but it is. And it is a beautiful gift, and it is an incredible life cycle gift. I mean, so to think about a little bit more, maybe for the gentlemen out here who don't know much about female anatomy. So the eggs come from our ovaries, and a woman is born with all of the eggs that she will have, all of them. We don't make more. We have a set supply, and that's what our bodies slowly release throughout the course of our life until we run out, right? Yeah. And then that's eventually, that phase is called menopause, where generally somewhere in our early 50s, we run out.
Yeah. My husband also doesn't like the word ovaries, so I'm just going to say it.
Ovaries.
Ovaries.
Yeah.
Ovaries.
Ovaries.
One more time. Ovaries.
Ovaries.
Okay.
So also then, so the ovaries then, you know, release these eggs every month. And then your uterus, which is where your bodies house babies, if they have one, like prepares itself to take a baby every single month. And then when a baby doesn't implant into the uterus wall, then your body gets rid of it and starts the cycle all over again. And that's what the bleeding is. And sometimes it feels like you're bleeding a lot, but it's really like, God, I remember the first time I looked it up and it was only like, 2 or 3 tablespoons. I was like, no way. But it's seriously, it's only like 2 or 3 tablespoons of blood, which I still find a little bit hard to believe, but apparently. Oh, and also for women out there who, I don't know if you've seen anywhere where like the COVID-19 vaccines were making women's periods like super extra harsh the month that they got their shots. Totally happened to me. It's the worst period I had in my entire life. So fun fact. That's a real thing.
Yeah. Well, and I actually, we're talking about all this like menstrual blood and stuff, but like I have a kind of birth control that I don't really bleed. So
yeah, which is cool. And so here's the thing. It's your body and that's your choice.
Yep.
And that should be I think the key to anyone listening, especially men. No one's telling you what to do with your body, and women should have that same freedom.
Yes. And I understand too that it is a privilege to have the access to this birth control, which also that could be a topic for another time.
Well, and to say too is like, I don't think people always realize too that like we use the term birth control, but that's not, I don't think that's the best word to describe it, because I think that comes with stigmas that people don't really realize that, women take these medications or have these implants for all sorts of reasons. Lots of them are very good medical reasons, because, not everyone has a super great, monthly cycle. And some of them can be really hard and really hard in women's bodies.
Like the woman in our gospel text.
Exactly. I'm sure she would have loved an IUD.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And that is, that's a good thing to bring up. So a lot of, yes, women that just bleed indefinitely, these are ways to help that. And for some people, it's not like it stops your menstrual cycle, but it regulates it.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Lots of things that, people maybe don't get to hear about on a normal basis because we're not allowed to talk about it.
Yeah. I hope people kept listening.
Yes. At least the women did, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But claim it, right? Claim your body, who you are, and this gift of life.
Yeah.
As we end here today, Pastor Kelsey is gonna end us out with a poem.
Yeah. So this comes from, I got this book in seminary as part of we had to have like some sort of Lenten devotional for one of our classes. And this is called Women Word, a Feminist Lectionary and Psalter. And this is women of the New Testament. So it goes through basically any woman that's mentioned in the New Testament and their story. And this is written by Miriam Therese Winter. And this is a reflection for the story that we just read, or a poem. When a young girl bleeds in a woman's way, she refrains from Eucharist in Ghana, I'm told. When a woman bleeds on days between the months she is with child, she cooks and eats her meals apart because she's defiled. So several wives for the man, you see, are a practical necessity, a tradition from old. Jesus, the blood of the woman who bled mingles with the blood you shed, as a sign of contradiction, for it has been revealed, who touches the hem of your justice absolutely will be healed, but not without crucifixion. Now, what will it take to stop the flood of discrimination associated with blood?
That feels like the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Pastor Kelsey, for joining us in our deep dive of a really, really good conversation. I appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
It is a lot of fun. That's why I do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see why you do it.
Well, thanks for joining us. That's it for this week. Please look for us next Tuesday on Shit They Don't Tell You on Sunday. Subscribe wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Shit They Don't Tell You on Sunday. As always, share this with friends and family, maybe especially young women in your congregations this week that you think would just, need a little bit of Jesus and to journey with us as we talk about some of these things. Well, catch you next time. Take care, everyone.